Okay, first of all, let's get some business out of the way. Congratulations to Spain on winning the World Cup. I think the best team won on the day. I have to say that because I have to say that, don't I? No, a little bit disappointing, but never mind. And we're going to be looking today, though. So now we've got that out of the way, we're going to be looking today at this story that Hubert read for us about the prophet Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, as she's known in the scriptures. And it's a interesting story. It's a pretty strange story, like many stories in the Bible. I think when you first read them, it's a little strange, but perhaps hard to relate to in some respects. But we're just going to unpack it a little bit and sort of glean some, hopefully, insights that can then help us in our own situations, in our own lives. The theme today is trusting in God's provision. And at some sort of simplistic level, I suppose, we could look at that story and say, oh, God provides for all your needs. But that may or may not be true, right? We've probably experienced times when we've gone without. And certainly if you look at the whole world, a lot of people are going without a lot. So that might be a simplistic view of what faith is. We're in a series called Stories of Faith, so we're exploring faith. So what I want to do this morning is just look at some of the context of this story, particularly in the way that what it tells us about God, divinity, reality, if you like, and how that might then influence or affect our faith, and in particular, our faith as it comes to trust and trusting God in the present moment, as we were sort of hearing about at the beginning of the service. So let's just do a little bit of a recap. Maybe we can look at that map again. Thanks, Greg. You remember last week we sort of talked a little bit about the history of the Hebrew people as it appears in the Bible. It's not necessarily objective history because the Bible's written with a certain perspective in mind. But if you remember, we talked about Abraham who leaves Ur in Mesopotamia. He went up to Haran, up there, still in Mesopotamia, but then comes down into Canaan. He's called by God to this land of Canaan here, which is the promised land. He spends a bit of time in Egypt, and he has children, and the family grows. And eventually they end up in Egypt again because Joseph is in Egypt, Jacob's son, who's the grandson of Abraham, and they're enslaved in Egypt. And then we have the story of the Exodus. Moses leads them out of captivity in Egypt. They wander around in the desert. They eventually get to round about here on the plains of Moab, and then in the book of Joshua, they cross over the Jordan into the promised land, and they start inhabiting this area of Canaan for real. And in the book of Judges, we hear about the 12 tribes of Israel, a sort of loose federation. They're not really an organized nation state. But eventually they get a king. They decide they want a king like every other nation around them. And they've developed a political system based on monarchy. But then there's civil war, and there's fractured relationships, and the country divides. And then eventually, empires from the areas of Mesopotamia where these people originally came from, empires like the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, begin to sort of control these areas. And you can see this is a very strategic place to be. It's by the ocean or by the Mediterranean Sea. So there's shipping coming in here. There are big trade routes here. So Israel becomes this sort of vassal state. Sometimes it's kind of powerful because it's in an interesting position in the world geographically, but sometimes it sort of gets caught up in these big empires battles, and eventually the northern kingdom is overrun by the Assyrians, and then the southern kingdom overrun by the Babylonians, and we have the period of exile. They ironically are taken back to Mesopotamia, and then after the exile there's a homecoming where they return, almost echoing that original story of Abraham, the original journey of Abraham. They return back to Canaan. That's just sort of a snapshot of the history we get in the Bible. Maybe we can just look at that slide that we looked at last week, Greg. So this itemizes the different stages. Now, we mentioned last week that really it's not until the time of the monarchy, around about 1000 BCE, that we really have any evidence of any of these stories in the Bible. Around about the time of the monarchy, beginning with Solomon, so in the early part of the 10th century BCE, we start getting other, archaeological evidence, and we also get other records in foreign countries' literature. So the literature of the Assyrians, for instance, and the Babylonians reference some of the kings and leaders in Israel and Judah. Let's just look at that divided kingdom slide. So when the kingdom divides, and this happens after the reign of Solomon, Solomon died probably about 930 BCE. The kingdom divides because his son is king in the south in Jerusalem, and at that point the whole country is united. But then the 10 tribes in the north break away based on some differences of political opinion, and the nation splits. And this is a time where we get lots more writings in the Hebrew scriptures that have some connection to writings in other literature. Particularly, the invading empires write about them. And of course, they're coming from very different perspectives. So what we said last week was probably, again, maybe we just go to the list slide, just skip on to the next one. So it's probably these first stories, the stories of the patriarchs, for instance, are stories that may have been oral traditions. They're sort of legendary stories. They're probably not objective history in the way that we think of history today. Although, again, last week we said there's no such thing as objective history because whoever's writing it always has an agenda, right? But it's probably stories that were told, that have been put together, that have been edited, that may be based on sort of legends and oral traditions that were handed down through the generations. We get some more historicity once we get to this part, to the monarchy. But again, it's not necessarily objective history. And scholars have noticed that there's a sort of a consistent agenda in these, what in the Christian tradition we call the historical books, books like Joshua, Judges, and the books of Samuel and Kings. In the Christian tradition, we talk about those as historical books because they relate history. Whereas for the Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible, they're called the prophets, the former prophets. The latter prophets are the prophets that actually had writings like Isaiah and Micah and Jeremiah, etc. So and let's look at the next slide here with the books of the Bible that we're talking about. So you can see Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers recount the story of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then Moses and the Exodus. Leviticus and Numbers have sort of history of the Hebrew people in the wilderness. And then we have this interesting book, Deuteronomy. These 5 books are called the Torah in Hebrew tradition, the law or the way. It's sort of, it's more than just legalities. It's a way of life. It's a way to follow God. But Deuteronomy is a little different, and that's why I've included it in this list of, along with what are known as the former prophets. Deuteronomy is an interesting book. The word Deuteronomos, Deuteronomy, means second law or copy of the law. And what happens in this book is the setting is Moses on the east side of the Jordan, okay, still in the wilderness, on the plains of Moab, looking across the Jordan, so to speak, and with the people of Israel about to enter the promised land. And Moses gives 3 speeches in which he looks back to their wandering in the wilderness. He talks in the second speech about the law. That's where the law is reiterated and things are added to it, and there's greater explanation about it. And then looking ahead to the future when they're in the land, and how they should live, and the fact that if they follow God, if they follow the law, things will go well, and if they don't follow the law, things will go badly. But there's always a hope of restoration. And those themes, the theological themes that are laid out in Deuteronomy, are very similar to the themes that you find in Joshua, in Judges, in Samuel and Kings. These books that Joshua relates the people going into the promised land. Judges is the period where they have this loose federation of tribes. Samuel, in the Christian tradition, we split that into 2 books, but that's when the people ask for a king. The monarchs come. We have Saul and David, and then by the time of the book of Kings, Solomon, and that's the setting for this story of Elijah. Now, the reason I mention this is because there's a pretty well accepted perspective amongst scholarship that these books, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, have the same editorial perspective. They weren't necessarily edited by one individual, but they're edited collectively with a particular perspective in mind, which has become known as the Deuteronomist perspective, or the Deuteronomist theology. And let's look at what so these are sort of themes running through these books that we will see in the story we just read. So let's look at our next slide. So what is the Deuteronomistic theology? What is the perspective through which this history is being told? What is the agenda, if you like, of the historian or the historians as they tell us these stories? And this is just a very abbreviated list that I've put together. Some of this is, I think, well accepted. Some of it's my perspective, but I think most of this will probably make sense. This is an oversimplified perspective, of course. First thing is that God is one. So in Deuteronomy, we get the Shema, the Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And, you know, we have really there the monotheistic perspective, which wasn't necessarily always true of the Hebrew people. So if you think about the 10 commandments, you know, from the book of Exodus, the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me, right? It doesn't say, I am the only God. It says, don't have any other gods before me. The assumption is that there are other gods. And in the early, we see an evolution of this monotheism from a more polytheistic perspective, which was that Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, was one God among many who was more powerful than the others. You know, but that evolves over time to a more monotheistic perspective. There's reasons for that, which we won't go into. But God is one. The issue of covenant. So do you remember last week we talked about the fact that Abraham, the father of this nation, was promised land, people, and prosperity. And the issue here is that God has made this commitment to people. God has made a commitment to this family. And if that family, that nation is obedient, things will go well. There will be land, people, and prosperity. And if they don't, they're not obedient, they don't follow the way of God, they don't follow Torah, which we'll come on to in a second, then things will not go well. And we see that being played out in these stories, like the stories of Elijah. There's an emphasis on centralized worship, so that God must be worshipped in a place. Initially, it's a place that nobody knows about. It's a place I will show you. It becomes Jerusalem eventually. And this perspective in Deuteronomy and in the Deuteronomist history is you shouldn't set up altars anywhere else other than in Jerusalem. Jerusalem and eventually the temple is where you worship God. And people who start worshiping God kind of out in the periphery nearly always get into trouble. They end up worshiping the wrong God or becoming idolatrous. And we see a little bit of that in the story we're looking at today. The perspective in these books is that we should be, or the nation should be, a theocracy. In other words, it should be dependent on God. What will hold the nation together is following the law, the Torah, the way. That's how the nation should exist. That's how it should prosper, by following the way of God. And prophets, and we see the rise of prophets in these books. The prophets call people back to the law. So, you know, when Jesus says, for instance, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, love God and love others, the Torah and the prophets kind of go together. Prophets are the ones who say, hey, we're not following God's way. We need to get back to God's way. And sometimes that results in conflicts. Often it doesn't go down well, especially with the establishment, because there's this tension between theocracy and monarchy. The perspective of these editors is that monarchy is not good. Power corrupts. and there's no need to have a king. We can just be dependent on God. Now, for me personally, I'm not sure I'd want to live in a theocracy or a monarchy necessarily, right? Because theocracies haven't been that great either. But I'm just saying the perspective of these writers is trust God, don't trust leaders with power. That's held, that perspective is held strongly. There are opposing views that you'll read in these texts, though, where there's more positive comments about the monarchy, and that's almost certainly because these texts have been edited from different stories and different traditions that have been come together, and some opposing perspectives are included, and that we shouldn't be worried about that. That's just quite natural. There's a massive emphasis in these books on social justice as part of the law. So what we're going to see, and we're going to see that in this story today, is that there's this tendency in the writer's perspective for human leadership, for human power systems to neglect the poor, to neglect the outsider. But right in the heart of the law, the Deuteronomistic law that's laid out in the book of Deuteronomy is a strong call to care for the poor, to care for the outsider, a commitment to neighbors. Okay, so be a good neighbor, but also be kind to people who are outsiders, kind to people who are foreigners, who live in your land, and especially to the poor. Let's look at that text, Greg, from Deuteronomy. For the Lord your God is God of gods. Going back to it, that has a sort of polytheistic flavor to it, doesn't it? Polytheistic flavor. The Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. Okay, so you can't, like, worshiping God is not about, hey, if I do this for you, God, if I sacrifice like this, if we go through all these religious rites, will you do me a favor and help me out and bless me? That's a very self-centered perspective on theology, on worship. But rather, no partiality, no bribery. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. So the poor are described as widows and orphans, fatherless and widows. And we see two such characters in this story that we just heard Hubert read to us. So social justice is part of this way. It's a huge part of this way. And that's very different to how the power systems of the day in the ancient Near East were set up. Let's go back to that list for the final point. The final point is restoration. There's an assumption built into this perspective that actually it's not going to go well, especially when this happens, monarchy. Once the kings come on the scene, it's kind of downhill. Well, there's a little bit of uphill. So, Saul, the first king, a bit dodgy. David's dodgy again, but sort of kind of redeems himself in some way. We'll talk about David next week. And then you have Solomon, and that Solomon is the time of the beginning of the book of Kings, time of great wealth and prosperity. He does all these deals with different nations, and it's probably the most powerful time of Israel's existence in the biblical accounts. And there's some archaeological evidence for that too. But as the book of Kings progresses, Solomon goes into demise, and he starts worshiping other gods. He has, I think it's 700 wives and 300 concubines, which has to be an exaggeration. I mean, it's got to be an exaggeration, right? But you just, probably what that's signifying is the sort of the marriages, arranged marriages that were part of the culture of the day for political reasons. He probably had a lot of wives, a lot of associates in that respect. And that was part of his wheeling and dealing. But the perspective from in the Book of Kings is that he actually set up altars for these for other gods, for the places where his wives or the people he'd done business deals with came from. Now you could look at that as maybe there's tolerance for other religions in the culture, right? But the perspective from the historians, this editorial perspective is that was disobedience to God, that was going in a different direction. And we get that feel very much from this story of Elijah that we're going to dig a little deeper into now. Okay, so that's just a little bit of the background. So the reason I mention all this is because these stories, some of which are a little odd and a little strange, are told through this perspective, through this lens. So this can help give us a little bit of an interpretive cue, a little bit of an understanding perhaps about what we're being told. And then we can, as we talked about last week, we can wrestle with the text, because some of what we're being told might not sit well with us. Some of it might be quite illuminating about humanity. And this is ancient wisdom, right? It's ancient wisdom in a very different context to ours. So we're going to sort of wrestle and struggle with it. Well, let's jump back into the story. So it's preluded, or the Book of Kings is preluded by the Book of Judges. And it ends, the last verse in the Book of Judges is, in those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. So is that good or bad? It's a difficult one. It's a bit of an ambiguous statement, isn't it? Because if everybody does what is right in their own eyes and they're following God and following the way of God, then great. But it could also be chaos. So you sort of see, I suppose, both perspectives. Do we want a king or don't we? As we know, eventually they have a king. And by the time we get to the Book of Kings, it's already going downhill, right? And this is one of the, as I said, one of the perspectives of the Deuteronomists is that monarchy is always corrupt. Power is always corrupted. So in the Book of Kings, just before the story we read, we hear this: in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, that's the nation in the south, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, and he built in Samaria. Incidentally, Omri, his dad, is one of the first kings of Israel where we also have the name used by other nations' writings. The Assyrians wrote about King Omri. King Omri built the capital in the north called Samaria, because obviously the capital, when it was a united kingdom, was in Jerusalem, so they needed a new capital. Omri built that capital. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. Okay, so what we have here is a Hebrew king called Ahab, who is presiding over the northern kingdom. Maybe we can just take a look at that map again. So this is Samaria, the capital. Here's the northern kingdom. Ahab is the king of this kingdom in the north. He marries Jezebel, who comes from Sidon, which is, you can just about see it there, Phoenicia, right? And that was probably an arranged marriage. It's probably part of this wheeling and dealing and, alliances and allegiances. And he starts worshipping Baal and Asherah. Baal was actually not just a Phoenician god, but a god that was worshipped quite widely in the ancient Near East. Baal means Lord, and there's just some different versions of Baal, but this particular version was a storm god. You could imagine why the Phoenicians, who were a seafaring people in the Mediterranean, they would want to have control over storms and storms from the sea that could damage the coastline, and also storms at sea where you're in a ship. You could imagine them in a superstitious kind of way, wanting, if there's a god of storms, wanting to worship that god and manipulate that god into being supportive and helpful. Also, of course, storms bring the rains. So Baal is also a fertility god, and Asherah was the consort of Baal, and worshipped with these poles that they describe, and again, a fertility goddess. So what we have here is a system that's not only religious, if you think about it, it's also an economic system, it's also a political system. This is where sort of the religious and political and economics of culture come together in a way that feels quite weird to us. But this is a system in place, a power system that's trying to control productivity, if you like, through fertility rituals, making sure that the rains come and there's a good harvest. And the king in this way of religion, or the monarch in this way of religion, was very responsible for making sure all that happened. And gods in this system don't really deal with people lower down on the ladder. Gods deal with kings. In fact, in some cultures, kings were even viewed as gods, like the pharaohs were viewed as gods. They're sort of caught up in this cosmic struggle. They're very powerful people, even though they're only human beings. You can see how that power, that kind of paradigm could seriously corrupt people. But this is so what's happening here is it's not just that Ahab is like, oh, I'm not into Yahweh anymore, I'm going to be into Baal. It's more the way of relating to God that's the issue. It's a way of manipulation, a way of control, rather than a way of covenant, of relationship. If you think about the Deuteronomist perspective, which is where the relationship of people with God is based on faithful obedience. It's based on approaching God as one who's kind and wants to bless, rather than one who's to be manipulated or bribed, as that scripture from Deuteronomy said to us. Okay, let's jump into the story itself now. Now, Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except by my word." So this is confrontation, right? We just talked about the system of Baal and Asherah. It's all about the rains. It's all about fertility. It's all about the harvest and economic wealth. And here's Elijah saying, it's going to be no rain. You're not in control, actually. You think you might be in control, but you're not. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed ravens to supply you with food there." So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Okay, so that's the first part. I think we've got a map here, haven't we, Greg, of this? Yeah, so here's, don't really, it's not so clear, but so here's Gilead. This is where he goes to. He crosses the Jordan. Here's the Jordan River, and you can just see the Kerith ravine. Now, the brook. So he stays in this brook. The brook is that word in the original language is the word wadi. You know, a wadi is a ravine that's been carved out by rainwater. And during the rainy season, it has water in it, and then it dries up in the dry season. And we've got, there's the Wadi Rum. I think we've got a picture of Wadi Rum there. Now, that is a very big wadi, right? I mean, you can see how that's been worn away. Some of them are smaller than that, and you imagine that where he was a smaller one. And so here he is. You know, we know the water's going to run out at some point, but he's got enough water, and he's fed by ravens. Now, ravens are... That word, again, if you look at the original Hebrew, that word could be translated Arabians, because you know, in the Hebrew, in the Bible, in the ancient script, it was just consonants, and you sort of sometimes it was confusing which vowels to put in there. So that could be. Most people translate it ravens. I'll just be honest about it. And that's pretty cool that ravens fed him. I mean, you know, especially if you're hungry, I suppose you have to be really, really hungry for that. But it could be that actually the provision was from people, outsiders. Maybe we could just skip back to the previous map, Greg. So he's crossed into, so this is his, you know, the territory of Israel and Judah. He's crossed the Jordan. He's in foreign territory now. And so here are outsiders, or at least people that aren't especially important in the eyes of these people, at least. Or if it was ravens, perhaps, I mean, it's little ravens that feed Elijah. So what we have here is these contrasts. Here is somebody who's just trusting God, who's just saying, okay, I'm not going to try and manipulate God. I'm going to be obedient to God. And the provision comes through the most unlikely sources. And that's in contrast to this king who's married a powerful woman from another nation to consolidate power, and is in control of distribution, and as we'll see, may not actually be very good about how they distribute the wealth in that context. So we have two very different paradigms. We're being shown two very different ways of life. There's the way of Yahweh, the way of God, the God of the Hebrews, and there's another way of following God that's kind of manipulative and controlling and quite selfish. Let's jump into the next part of the story. Sometime later, the brook dried up. Well, no surprise there, because it's not raining. There had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me some water in a jar so I may have a drink? And she was going to get it. As she was going to get it, he said, oh, and bring me please a piece of bread. She's adding to the list. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I mean, there's a drought, there's a famine, right? So what's he doing asking him for food? I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make for yourself something for you and for your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rains on the land. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. So again, we have these contrasts, right? We have these. If you think about the system that the Baal system, if you like, the fertility system, the control system is all about having plenty. It's all about securing the future. It's all about having control over supply, having control over productivity. In this story, we see somebody being very dependent in the moment. There's a simplicity to this. Now, let's not over glamorize it, because the woman's collecting sticks. She's still being faithful in the present moment, because she's thinking, well, I'll just collect the sticks, have a fire, eat what we have, and then we'll die. It's a little depressing, right? It's a little fatalistic. But what we have here is I think, a system of obedience and faithfulness, where Elijah is saying, don't worry, trust God. It's going to be okay. Just trust for this moment, and you'll be okay in this moment. I don't know about tomorrow. And that sounds very much like some of what we've heard before when we listen to the words of Jesus, right? When Jesus taught us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. There's a sort of dependency in the moment that is difficult and in some sense, perhaps overly simplistic and naive. And yet there's something really liberating about it. There's something intimate about it. There's a divine connection to it that is somehow more beautiful than the bribery and manipulation and partiality of the Baal system, as we're seeing it in this setting and in this story. It reminds us, we won't read this whole passage, but it reminds us perhaps of when Jesus said, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow has enough trouble of its own. Don't worry about what you eat, what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink. And in fact, when Jesus references the lilies of the field, the flowers of the field, or the birds of the air, he interestingly says, not even Solomon in all his glory was arrayed like one of these. In other words, you think about the most prosperous time of Israel's history, as we were talking about earlier. Well, God loves us. God's with us. God's present to us in in this beautiful, loving way rather than a manipulative kind of way, or a way in which we have to manipulate God to get what we want. There's this covenantal connection. There's this relational connection. That's what faith is. It's not about some superstitious manipulation of the universe. It's being in relationship and being in the way of God. Now, Zarephath, we won't go back to the map, but unless you can, Greg, if you can, that one, the Elijah map. Yeah, oh, brilliant. So here's Zarephath up in the north, in Phoenicia, very close to Sidon, which is where Queen Jezebel comes from. So here we have another outsider, right? So, and Jesus makes this point. Jesus tells a story about this widow in Luke chapter 4, and says, he talks about the prejudice of the people towards outsiders in his day, and quotes this story and saying, when Elijah needed to find somebody who was going to be faithful, he couldn't find him in Israel. He had to go to the outside. So here we have again the Deuteronomistic perspective of look after the outsiders. There's no elitism here. It's not like, I don't think we've got the best way and it's the only way, and everybody else is wrong. But rather, it's like, include people in what you have, and share what you have. So give us this day our daily bread, and let's pray that we'll have enough that we can share with other people. Let's jump into the last part of the story, and I'm just going to summarize this for the sake of time, but we've read the story already. Hubert read it a little bit earlier. In the last part of the story, we have the son dying, right? Do you remember that? So it's ironic that she thinks we're both going to die. Elijah kind of saves them with the flour and the oil that doesn't run out, and then the son dies anyway. And you can sort of pick up her like, what the heck? What was that about? What was that about? And there's this beautiful resurrection story. Now, it's obviously full of symbolism, like Elijah lying down on the boy 3 times. Do you remember that? Does anybody know what that signifies? Because I have no clue whatsoever. I mean, come and tell me afterwards. I don't know what, it probably has some really deep meaning. I'm probably sounding really, stupid right now. But here's the deal, I think, about this story. Again, widows and orphans, right? That's the way the poor are described in this perspective. And there's a reason for that, because for women in that time, if you didn't have a husband, you had a chance of being destitute. This is obviously a poor woman, just the way the economy worked then, the way the culture worked then. And so her son, her only son, is in some sense her economic well-being, her future economic well-being. And if she loses her son, this is as much an economic catastrophe as it is a emotional catastrophe, a relational catastrophe. Obviously, it's more than just that. But we could look at this story from an economic perspective, and when the son comes back to life, this is God taking care of the poor through Elijah in the way that the poor should be taken care of by leaders, by monarchs, by political systems. But political systems don't do that. In fact, in 1 Kings 21, so this is chapter 17 of Kings, 1 Kings. In chapter 21, there's a horrible story about a chap called Naboth who owns a vineyard. And Ahab, the king, wants it. And he offers to buy it. And the guy says, no, I'm not gonna sell this. This is my inheritance. This is been in my family. I'm not going. And Ahab's kind of goes home, sulks. And his wife, Jezebel, says, what's up? And he goes, tells her why. She goes, leave it to me. And she sets Naboth up so that he ends up being falsely convicted of crimes. He's stoned to death. And she goes back to Ahab and says, hey, take the vineyard. It's yours now. That's what despots do, right? That's what corrupt power does. It uses its power to oppress people and to gather more wealth. And it's all part of this manipulation system. And we are seeing that contrasted. We didn't get to read that second story today, but we are seeing that contrasted here with God taking care of the poor, looking after the poor. This is the way of God. This is where people are helped and included, and there's enough for everybody, as opposed to systems that gather more and more and more and control production, and it's all about wealth for the few that have power. We also, in this story, I think, see that perhaps coming back to life is representative of the life that comes through this way of Yahweh, this way of interacting with God is life-giving and healing and transformative, and it's good. Now, if you read the law, the Torah, there's stuff about it that I personally find troubling. So we're talking in very broad brushstrokes here, but the intent of the law, according to Jesus, and Jesus reinterpreted the law, right? He said, you've heard it said this, I say this. He seemed to get behind the law and get more at what it was meant to do, rather than it's some dotting the I's and crossing the T religious stuff. Jesus was constantly getting to the life-giving stuff that comes through this faithful obedience to the way of God. And we see that actually played out, that same kind of thing played out in Luke chapter 7. So here's a story about Jesus. And if you remember from our studies of Luke, which we've done over the last year or so, Luke, the author of Luke, portrays Jesus as a Hebrew prophet. And Jesus brings a widow's son back to life in a very similar kind of way. In fact, let's look at some of the language from that. So the boy is dead, or it could be a man, we don't know the age. This is in Jesus' time, is dead on the funeral bier. He went up and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearer stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Same language used in the Elijah story, if you remember from Hubert's reading. Elijah gave him back to his mother. Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were filled with awe and praised God. A great prophet has appeared among us. Okay, this is like Elijah. They said, God has come to help his people. I think this is what this story is about in Elijah's day. It's like God has come to help his people. God is here for us. God is faithful. God is committed to us. God isn't let's just say, we don't really know God, right? I mean, it's a mystery. But whatever God is or God isn't, God is not some a being that's open to manipulation, that helps these people, doesn't help those, that is sort of there to prop up powerful elites. But rather, God is present to everyone. God is perhaps even more present to the people who have less, because there's fewer barriers. There's less distractions. There's less complexity or less chance of manipulation and agendas and that kind of thing. And I wonder if in these stories too, and we'll close with this, but in these stories too, that the issue again isn't so much who's the right God. Is it Yahweh? Is it Baal? Is it Asherah? This isn't. And so these kings, I don't think the stories of these kings who set up temple or altars and poles and all that, I'm not sure it's so much, oh, I'm into Baal today and I'm into this other God tomorrow. It's more how do we relate to God? And the Hebrew tradition, this tradition that comes through Torah, shows a way of relating to God that's just more life-giving than this deathly religion. And if we, so it's perhaps not even about the name. Baal means Lord. When the word Yahweh is written in the English Bible, it says Lord. It's not so much about the identity necessarily, so much as how do we relate to God? And if there's one God, this evolving monotheism that we see in these stories, if there's one God, then it's not about, well, our God's just a better God or a more powerful God. It's about what is God like? So these stories are about the nature of divinity. They're about love versus control. And I think that's what Jesus was getting at. Do you remember in John's gospel, Jesus walks through Samaria, which is this old kingdom of the north, very much hated by the people in the south. And he walks through Samaria and he encounters a woman at the well. And there's this really interesting conversation because the Samaritans, who were the hundreds of years later, the descendants of the northern kingdom, they have a different kind of religious system. It's similar to the Jewish one, but different. And there was a lot of sort of competition, a lot of disagreement about who was right, who was wrong. Here's what Jesus says. Sir, the woman said, I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where you must worship is in Jerusalem. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, the time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain, that was her holy site, nor in Jerusalem. The Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet, a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. So what we have here is this intimacy, this reality, Jesus seems to be saying, if we're thinking about religious credentials and what's the better religion and who's right and who's wrong, we're kind of missing the point. It's about how we relate to God. Perhaps even whether you're going to a mosque or a church, whether you call God God or Allah, or whether you call did you see what I mean? I wonder if actually there's something beautifully universally inclusive about humanity and our different perspectives, our different ways of approaching God, but it's about how. And is it life-giving? Is it kind? Does it take care of people? Is it for powerful people to use and abuse? We've done plenty of that, right, in the history of Christianity. Or is it committed to justice, committed to the poor, committed to care for people? Let's close with this final slide, and maybe the band could come up, because we'll have a time of communion. What can we take away from this story? So some of the things that I've mentioned already, this sense of simplicity, that faith, there's a simplicity to faith, something it's uncomplicated. It's not perhaps necessarily all that glamorous, but it's just vulnerable and dependent. Secondly, the sacrament of the present moment, that all we have is this present moment. Like we can worry about tomorrow, we can have regrets about the past, but somehow God is found in this present moment, going out, picking up your sticks, even though you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, trusting that there's enough for today, even though we don't know whether we'll have enough for tomorrow. It's in these moments, in this moment, that we find the reality of God. Thirdly, faith is community. It's a community enterprise. We talked about this a little bit last week. It's interesting that provision, if we're talking about depending on God for provision, it comes from other people, or birds, if we translate that word ravens. So in other words, there's something very interdependent about this, something very horizontal, it's like trusting one another. It's also about the fourth point, it's about justice and compassion. So it's not just about trusting one another, but it's actually saying, oh, I'm going to help you. That's important. You being included, you having enough, that's a faithful response. It's not just about what I get, it's about what I provide. The kings just stopped doing that. They didn't look after the people. They looked after the elites. They looked after their own well-being. Fifthly, it's about oneness with God. We talk about monotheism. God is one, but we are one with God, as Jesus said. That we belong. We're part of this, and we're going to celebrate that now as we take communion. And everybody's welcome to take it. We have gluten-free crackers and fruit juice here at the front and in the middle. So just get up, move around. When you're ready, take some back to your seat, or you can take it actually at the tables. We have, if you check out your flyer, the community flyer, it explains about all the different stations we have around the room. You can write out prayers, you can light candles, somebody can pray with you, you can just spend some time in your seat. But let's just, as we have this moment, let's be in the moment. And perhaps just for the moment, leave our concerns from this morning, yesterday, the day before, and leave our fears of what is yet to come, things that we might be worried about, and just be present to God and with God in this moment and just soak it up. So I'm going to pray, and then please come forward. Lord, we're thankful for these beautiful stories that are kind of troubling, and some of them hard to understand, but what a gift that these stories have been treasured and handed down. And Lord, I pray that however we interpret these individually, whatever they mean to us, for each one of us that's going to be different, Lord, may we sink into the reality of your presence, of your simple, loving presence to us that longs for relationship, that longs for oneness. And just as the Hebrew people returned home after the exile, they went back. There was a homecoming. Lord, we want to just come home this morning to you, to your presence, to the heart of God, to the love that's at the core of the universe. So welcome us in that place, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.